Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Menopause Collective with me, Sarah Utley, your host. And today I am joined by Clarissa Kristjansson. Clarissa is a mindfulness and menopause expert. She's also the author of the Mindful Menopause, the host of Thriving Through Menopause Podcast, and an international speaker on menopause. And I'm absolutely delighted to have you here with us. Thank you so much, Clarissa.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about my favourite subject, which is menopause.
Menopause, yes, and mine. And you are calling from Sweden, where you live.
Yes, that's where I live now. This is actually where I spent a lot of my childhood because my mother was Swedish. And so a lot of my holidays and spare time was spent here with my family. And I moved here 4 years ago, post-menopause, had that big life change after living nearly 15 years in Australia.
And where else have you lived?
I've lived in the UK, I've lived in Holland, and I've spent a lot of my life working in every single country from the obvious ones in Europe to even doing research in places like Hebron in the West Bank of the West Bank and Gaza. So I've been some amazing different places around the world.
And you've had a successful corporate career working for global organizations, mainly in consumer insights, before becoming a mindfulness expert. What led you to make that transition from that corporate career towards, in particular, neuroscience and mindfulness?
Well, I am a neuroscientist by training. I mean, that's my original background was, hardcore research, PhD, then working in corporate for 30 years. I think the road had run out for me in many ways. Some of that was related to the experiences I was having through my perimenopause. I had a lot of anxiety, and I think that was badly handled in corporate. And I think also that I'd done with it. I was done with corporate, with the petty rules, the KPIs that in the end of the day, you think they're pretty meaningless. If we're going to have a bell curve for people's, promotion and pay rise, and we're not really paying attention to the person, what is this about? And I think it's also what a lot of women talk about. We're tired of being spoken over. We're tired of somebody, probably a male, but I'm not turning this into a feminist conversation, speaking and saying the same thing you've said, and then they're heard by senior people. And all of those experiences together are what brought me to saying, I'm done with this. And when I did resign, there was some pretty bad behavior that went on. I swore in the office. I'm not a person who lets rip. And I slammed my books on the desk and told them exactly what I thought. And that was the end of it. I didn't even work out my notice. But I think
turning back from that.
No, there was no turning back from that. But I think that that's not uncommon for women. And if you read the book by Marianne Siegert that's come out, it's called The Authority Gap. Is out now, and she really talks about that, and having interviewed amazing people like Janet Keller and Julia Gillard and others, they've experienced that at a much more public level, but every woman. And I think at this age, we're different. We're mentally different. We're emotionally different in the end of our menopause and beyond. And we don't put up with these things and we say, I'm done. And I think that's part of the great resignation that's going on with later life women.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that really resonates. You mentioned about anxiety, and obviously a lot of people suffer with anxiety through perimenopause, the changing hormone levels and the spike in cortisol. How did that anxiety manifest for you within the workplace? What did it feel like on a daily basis?
Well, it's terrifying, actually. I mean, I would qualify that with saying that I have lived with anxiety all my life. So I don't think of myself as a sufferer. I think of myself as an anxiety sister, and there are so many of us that are in that space, but I had the ability to manage that But in perimenopause, there's a huge amount of change in the brain. We have changes to our HPA axis, which is our stress response axis. There are big changes to the hippocampus and to our emotional regulatory centers in the brain because of the shifts in both estrogen and progesterone. And so anxiety can surface. And for me, it felt awful. It felt like every day there was some sort of panicky feel that I would not be able to do the work I could do, and I knew I could do. So there's a loss of that confidence that anxiety brings out. There was this going to meetings and feeling anxious that you weren't going to get your voice heard. So it resulted in bad behavior from me in my own sense, because then I would speak over people and I wouldn't know when to shut up. That's anxiety in action. And I did actually have a panic attack in the office, which was a lived experience that I don't think anybody would like to repeat. I certainly wouldn't want to repeat it. I'd had panic attacks before. I'd had one as a child and I had had one in a private setting. But at the office, it is a complete physical experience, because anxiety is not a mental experience. You feel it, you sweat, you can't breathe properly, and then you can't articulate as well. And that moment was in front of a very senior manager, and he thought I'd run up the stairs. I have no idea to this day what I said to him.
And that is interesting, because when I'm in the throes of anxiety, my brain just stops functioning and I can't think rationally at all. It's like rabbit in headlights. So that's, when we spoke before, what you said really resonates. I've had that shared experience of anxiety, and it is something that you learn to live with, accept, and find ways to breathe through it and live through it. But I don't think it ever fully goes away.
No, it never goes away. I think what we can do, as you rightly said, we can learn to, I would almost say, acknowledge that this is me. And that we have tools with which we can cope with the situation. We can manage to work our way through it. And we have ability, I think, when we've learned some practices, to almost like be able to break that mind twirl that takes over. But you're right, in that moment, you're in full fight, flight, freeze mode. And often we're frozen and don't know what to do. And your whole system just wants you to get out of there. But it does go through. You can learn to live with it. And there are some fabulous therapy tools along with mindfulness that really do that for you.
Yeah. And is that what got you interested in the mindfulness practice?
Definitely, without
because
doubt,
obviously
Sarah.
as a neuroscientist, you obviously understand how the brain works and the chemicals, but mindfulness, I mean, it's related to it, but is that your experience of going, I've had enough of corporate life, I want something completely different?
I think that panic attack, although I didn't leave corporate for a number of years afterwards, was the tipping point for me to seek a different way through this. I've always avoided going to therapists. It has a lot to do with my childhood and my mother's idea that if you spoke to a psychologist, the social workers would take you away. Maybe they did or didn't. But so I always had that sort of pathological kind of distancing. I don't want to be anywhere near them. But at that point, I realized that I couldn't continue my life the way it was. It was making me very unhappy. It was impacting my child. And so I had to make a turning point there. And it was by sheer chance that I was connected to somebody who was a senior trainer of a mindfulness organization that happened to be around the corner from where I lived in Sydney. But Timothy Goddard is a therapist. She's a yoga therapist, and she's also the founder of the biggest mindfulness training organization in Australasia. And it was there that I began to put the framework together, I would say, to being better able to handle stress and anxiety in my life. And of course, when you have some tools to do that, then you have the tools to help yourself sleep. You focus on what you're eating, you start to exercise mindfully. It flows into your life in a different way.
How lovely. And mindfulness has become more commonplace these days. And particularly through COVID, many organizations have made certain apps available, such as Headspace, meditation and mindfulness app available through their wellness programs. What does mindful living mean to you?
It means to me 4 things. It means to me that you can be with things as they are, and I think that's a good rule of thumb in perimenopause, be with this transition and journey as it is. That you can pay attention and be aware of your own body, and that's a really good thing, because the body is very grounding. If you ground in sensory experiences like your breath or your feet pressed onto the ground, then you're always able to switch out of your head and into the body, this sense of dropping into the body. So paying attention, being aware. It's about being fully present as well. And I think that's kind of different from dropping in the body. You're present to your experience and know that it's always changing as well. You're in an ever-changing experience if you're present. Because if I was to say to you, write down your emotions now, and then an hour later write them down, you'd see that your experience is much more fluid than you think it is. And I trained with working a lot with chronic pain because I'm a breathworks trained practitioner, and we taught people who were very severely ill that their experience of pain is fluid too. And that's the same for your perimenopause. Your symptoms are also fluid. They're not all at 100% of the time. They fluctuate and go. And when you realize that life is flow, then you're able to address the points when it's not so good and realize that you can come back into the parts of life or experiences that are better.
Lovely. And what's your daily mindfulness practice? What does that look like for you?
For me, that takes a number of forms. I meditate every day, but I would hasten to say that you don't have to be a serious meditator to practice mindfulness, because I would say meditation is a tool in mindfulness rather than an essential. But I do meditate. I belong to a Buddhist Sangha, and we meet in the mornings online these days. And so I meditate in silence with other people. I spend time in nature every day. And I think that sense of being in nature and taking away your phone. I don't go out with my phone on, much to my husband's frustration. He says to me, "It can never ring you, you're out." But I am out, and I've coupled away from that extraneous noises that are very prevalent in our society. And I walk in nature with the dog. I stop and I see, all the little things, the good things. So I'm always letting in the good. A little flower came up, a little bird flew here. That's allowing us to be present and positive. And, then I just make time and space to rest somewhere in the day. And rest is an important component of mindfulness. You're listening to your body and knowing that we need to rest. And in perimenopause, we need to rest a lot more than we do.
That's a very good point. Being aware of what your body needs during perimenopause and not fighting that. I think I thought that for a long time and ended up being really burnt out, and just give myself permission to say, I'm not feeling good. I need to do nothing. And that's what I need. And that's all right. It's a really powerful message that you can send yourself. And once you've given yourself permission, it opens up other things to give yourself permission for as well.
I would agree. I think that rest is something that our society sees as being negative. And I'm like, are you crazy? The system can't run like it did. And I think I interviewed somebody, it might have been Claire Snowden Darling, and we talked about women's lives prior to this sort of we're at work and superwoman and we're doing a job when we get home, that, you know, our grandparents would have sat down after their housework and had a cup of tea, done a bit of knitting, chatted with a friend, and that was rest. We don't give ourselves that grace anymore. We go full pelt from 7 to 7 quite often by the time we're home. We change our uniform and we start a second job, which involves meals, and we think we should have gone to the gym, and then we're going to clean the house, and, you know, then we're folding laundry at 1 a.m. And I have people that I've worked with who do things like that. And we haven't given ourselves 15-20 minutes with a cup of tea to sit down and just say, I'm just decompressing for a bit.
That leads me very nicely, thank you, Clarissa, onto cognitive load. And I heard you on a podcast the other day talking about cognitive load on women in midlife, and how that contributes towards their experience of menopause. Can you just tell us more about what you mean by cognitive load?
I think that's that over busy mind. That is when our brain, we really can't take in anymore in our brains. We are multitasking, which we know isn't really multitasking. There's no person on the planet that can do that. So your brain is switching from one task and the other. So we're never really focused and completing anything. We have, as women, just too much responsibility today, and we keep on taking on more and more. And in midlife, that burden is not just our job, but as I said, it's our family. It can be everything that the world on social media is telling us that we should and must and could do. It's all the impossible goals that we're setting ourselves internally with our own inner voice. We may be taking on the role of caring for our parents, and we may not be doing some of these things physically, but we're doing them mentally. And there is no space in our heads. And when our brains are overloaded and we go through perimenopause, and the first organ in the body that experiences perimenopause is the brain. I love the work of Professor Jayashri Kulkarni at the University of Monash, and she really talks about the brain being in perimenopause 5 years before the body is physically in menopause, and the changes to our brain. And we know that from the work of Lisa Mosconi as well. We can see those MRI scans of the brain. And so when we're overloaded, the brain is already in this enlarged amygdala. We've got the hippocampus out of whack. Our emotional centers, our focus and our memory centers of the brain are not functioning. I mean, we can see that if we look at the brain. People who are overstressed have this enlarged amygdala. They have a less developed prefrontal cortex. All the areas that the loss of estrogen is going to compound are already in place. And stress, of course, mimics perimenopause symptoms. If we were to put up a list of the either of those two together, they look very like each other. So it's stress or it's perimenopause. It's the answer is you're going through a hormonal change, which is natural and normal, but stress compounds everything. And so you're completely out of whack. So we have to reduce all this mental chatter, and a lot more is the mental chatter in our head. And we have to make time to simplify our lives, lay out some boundaries here. We're all, as females, we're bad at boundaries. So we have to start to say, I can't do this, or not now. We have to ask for help. We're very bad at that. And we have to start to reduce all this noise in our mind. And biggest of all is our own inner critic.
I work with a lot of women through coaching about setting boundaries and changing perspective on that inner narrative and that monkey on their shoulder. I read an article the other day by Linda Marshall, who actually trained me through Barefoot Coaching. She wrote a great article on cognitive load and the disparity between men and women in terms of cognitive load. It was fascinating. And I've kind of highly resonated with my kind of life. Women, when they get up in the morning, they plan what we're going to have for tea. It's the school bag packed. Has the dog been wormed? It's all those things that women tend to take on in the house, on top of a career, on top of caring, on top of parenting, etc. The stuff that men don't do. And again, like you, I'm not on a feminist thing, but it's just interesting to observe different roles. And there's a long way to go before we really balance the gender imbalance on these types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Because, and I think we've just stepped into these roles. I mean, one of the questions I often ask people that I work with is, what kind of self-care did your mother practice? Because that is our role model in life. We don't realize that. And of course, all of those behaviors are then embedded to us from childhood. Our mothers do lots of stuff that we also automatically do. And you talked about Linda's article. I'd also say there was a great book called Why Women Don't Sleep. And it wasn't why they don't physically sleep, but it was an exactly narratives from women all around the US in their sort of typical Gen X women who have just bought into this whole do it all, be it all model. And it's impossible for us to do this. And so we end up really feeling like we're never on top of anything. And perimenopause is sometimes a bit of a hard stop for us, because our body is actually going through a massive biopsychosocial change. And we at the same time are just trying to be, what we were at 35, and we were struggling then. So we don't have the bandwidth to do this journey very well. And I think that is showing up now in the experiences of women who are just saying, I'm exhausted, I can't sleep, I've got anxiety, I'm out of whack, really.
And it's an uncomfortable place to be when you don't recognize yourself and when you feel dislocated from your life. And I hear a lot of that with the women I work with, that sense of loss of identity and just crushing fatigue. That means you just can't think. You don't give yourself space to think and to be.
Yeah, to be is a big one. I just don't think we cut ourselves any slack. I mean, we go on holiday, but we carry on doing stuff when we get there. And I think we're afraid to delegate. That is one of the things we hold on to the reins of everything very tightly, even when we can delegate. And some of those are wrapped up in our own impossible standards of how we think should be done. And there's a lot of unwinding of that, particularly, I think, at home. And we're not saying we should let standards go at work necessarily, but sometimes at home, we do lots of things that we don't necessarily need to do to the same degree.
I wonder if that's tied in with fear of judgment and failure.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah. Definitely. I think we're afraid of failing. We're afraid of not living up to the standards that society has set for what your house should look like, and what your relationship should look like, and how well your children should be succeeding. And I think we also define ourselves for a long time through their success. And that, I think, is the other side that changes post menopause.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I was just about to ask you or to comment on all that you've said is then layered by society's views of how women should be or should look, and that disparity between the youthful images that we are bombarded with versus the reality of women's lives. And that can be quite crushing to self-esteem, confidence, particularly when your hormones are completely out of whack and you're not thinking rationally.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think on the one hand, we've been very obsessive about youth, but I'd also say that we have now created these silver influencers. Good luck to them, but we are not spending all day working with a personal trainer, a nutritionist, having your hair dyed perfectly, being perfectly made up, having clothes given to, most of us, our lives are not like that and never will be. So although we're seeing more older people represented, again, sometimes those are not represented with different standards from the younger women. And then we're presented with stereotypical images on top of that of women in perimenopause and beyond who are women my age. I mean, you know, you're not supposed to be representing someone who's mid-40s with a 60-year-old woman at all. I mean, this is, so we're seeing very negative images of what it looks like to age, or unrealistic, or an obsessive with you. So you're not able to say, well, where am I, a real woman in the midst of this?
I agree. And ultimately, you're very passionate about encouraging women to see menopause as transformative. And in fact, there's research to suggest that post-menopause, our brains recover and become stronger, and we become more creative and more focused. Can you tell us more about the science there and what that means for the future narrative around menopause?
I think, well, part of it obviously is the science behind that is there's beginning to emerge understanding that our brains literally recover from this menopause mess, if we like, and we see a different looking brain in some ways. It doesn't look like when we were younger either. So there's obviously, this is at its infancy, but I've also had the great pleasure to interview Dr. Luann Brizendine. She's a University of California clinical professor of psychiatry. She's a New York Times bestseller, and her new book is called The Upgrade, and it's based on her decades of experience. I mean, she's nearly 70, of working with women in her hormone clinics and as a psychiatrist, and just saying, you know, what we're seeing in women's brains and the way women are presenting themselves post-menopause says everything you mentioned there, Sarah, that they are dropping the multitasking. They're more focused, they are more creative, we're articulate in new ways, and there's just everything to look forward to, not to look backwards and say I'm broken or deficient, you know, and I'm very against that word, and you'll hear me speak quite loudly against things like depletion and deficiency, because I think that those words create a negativity and a victim mentality, which we're not. Perimenopause is tough, but when we go through it and we do the right things, not just the brain being better, but we put in place those pillars that will support us to feel well. So yes, exercise, diet, managing our stress, but connection and purpose are a huge part of this transformation. And we have that change opportunity during this change period.
Connection and purpose. Those are the things that I work with my clients. And it brings me full circle back to your meditation practice, where you do that with other people online in silence. What is it about the connectivity of being with other people in practicing meditation?
There's a different kind of energy. I think we go into a sense of being together, and that although each of us is in our own meditation space, there's a real sense of a shared space, and that it's a strange thing because it's hard to kind of articulate because it's a felt thing. But what I noticed that when I meditate, and others would probably say the same, is you can stay in your meditation practice for longer, that we can all know that we're not all sitting perfectly, because sometimes you open your eyes and you see someone else has opened their eyes, and we move around and that. So we feel probably less pressure in some ways because we're all human and people are wriggling and coughing, but we're learning also to be with what is, because, you know, if you're just on your own with an app, your 10 minutes, you might be there. But when you're with other people, there's this sense of a lived experience with others. It's an amazing thing. And that's often why you go away on retreat and you think, oh, I've meditated here a whole hour with a whole group of others, and I wouldn't do that at home. But it's a very unique experience. And that's why I meditate with others, and found that was more helpful for me to stay anchored to a longer practice, which for me is not about mindfulness, but it's about insight. When you sit longer, there are real insights that can come up.
I haven't done long meditation practice. That sounds intriguing. But when I do meditate, I'm aware that I'm not just doing it for myself. I'm doing it for having, an impact on those around me, and that ripple effect, which is often a good way to think about meditating with others as well. It's that shared connection, that shared energy, that what you get and receive through that.
Definitely. And to know that if you've had a struggling time, you're not alone. And I think that I learned that I went on a retreat, and there were people there who'd meditated for more than 50 years. So they were incredibly experienced meditators, and they sometimes go, oh, that was just an awful experience. I couldn't stay focused at all. And sometimes they would get up and just leave. And then you realize, well, I have days when that happens to me, but I'm not alone. There's not some sort of magic experience that happens because you've meditated for 50 years. Your brain can just do its thing anyway, because that's what it does, and it likes to shoot new ideas in, and it wants to shift focus, and that happens to all of us. It's just that they realize that that's not a fault of them, and they come back into their meditation the next day or the next time, and they keep going. It's consistent and persistent, I think, in meditation as much as it is in anything else in life.
Takes practice.
Yeah, it's a practice. And I say that mindfulness is a practice, and you have to keep practicing. And then, like anything else, like lifting weights or eating differently, it's the same.
Lovely. Well, it's been a delight speaking with you, Clarissa. Before we go, do you have any tips for people wanting to start mindfulness practice but don't know where to start?
If I was saying to you, I would say get to work with a teacher, because even though apps are wonderful, and I never knock them for helping you maintain your practice, there is a very different thing when you learn with someone who teaches you. You learn why you're doing it. There's a stepwise approach, whether you train through MBSR, Breathworks, or whoever you choose to be your teacher. They also work with you. In the UK, we are all covered by the BAMBRA guidelines. So people have ability to assess risk, because there can be risk if you've suffered from trauma or other things. So they work with you to learn how to do this and to embed those practices. And then you can go on your own journey and explore more, use apps. I love Insight Timer. It's free. There are wonderful teachers on there. So I would say that's an app to explore with some of the best teachers in the world. But definitely begin with a short course. There are plenty of them. You can do them online as a group. And being in a group is important, because your experience is something you should talk about and share.
Lovely. And how do you typically work with clients? What kind of services do you offer, and how can people find out more about you, Clarissa?
So I do coach a small number of women leaders through perimenopause, and you can get that through my website. That's ClarissaKristjansson.com. And I regularly run mindfulness workshops. As a Breathworks practitioner, I'm listed on the Breathworks site, and I put my mindfulness practices, mindfulness for menopause practices there when people want to join. And we have small groups, because we work with groups of no more of sort of 8 to 10 people, so that we can be close and intimate. And the best way to do that is to also look on my website for when I'm doing those.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Clarissa. It's been a real pleasure and honor speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Thank you.